The woman's body lay crumpled beside the frozen creek like a discarded doll, her lips tinged blue, and her breath coming in shallow gasps that turned to frost in the bitter January air of 1877. Harrison Granger had been tracking elk through the Sangre de Cristo Mountains when he spotted her from the ridge above, and now he was running down the steep slope with his rifle still strapped across his broad back, his long, dark hair whipping behind him as panic surged through his veins. No one should be out here alone, not in the heart of winter when the high country of northern New Mexico territory could kill a person in hours. He crashed through the snow-laden brush and dropped to his knees beside her, his massive hands surprisingly gentle as he turned her face toward him. She was young, maybe 22 or 23, with auburn hair that had come loose from its pins and skin so pale it looked translucent. Her dress was soaked through from falling in the shallow water at the creek's edge, and ice crystals were already forming on the wet fabric. Harrison knew she didn't have much time. "Can you hear me?" His voice was rough from days of silence in the mountains, but there was an urgency to it that demanded response. Her eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes the color of honey, and a small sound escaped her chattering teeth. "Cold," she whispered. "So cold." Harrison didn't waste another second. He shrugged out of his heavy coat, the bearskin-lined garment that had kept him alive through countless winters, and wrapped it around her shivering form. She was small enough that the coat engulfed her completely, but even that wouldn't be enough if he didn't get her warm and dry soon. The nearest town was Santa Fe, at least 2 days' ride away, but his cabin was only 5 miles north through the mountain pass. He'd built it 3 years ago when he'd left civilization behind to trap and hunt in solitude, seeking peace after the war had stolen too much from him. "I'm going to pick you up now," he said, already sliding his arms beneath her. "My cabin isn't far. You're going to be all right, I promise you that." She didn't protest as he lifted her against his chest, and Harrison was struck by how light she felt despite being soaked through. His muscles, hardened from years of hauling game and chopping wood, barely registered her weight as he began the trek back the way he'd come. The snow was falling harder now, thick flakes that would cover their tracks within the hour, and he picked up his pace. His promise to her wasn't something he'd said lightly. Harrison Granger didn't make promises he couldn't keep, not anymore. The woman drifted in and out of consciousness as he walked, occasionally mumbling words he couldn't quite catch. He held her tighter, using his own body heat to warm her, and focused on putting one foot in front of the other. The afternoon light was already fading by the time his cabin came into view, a sturdy structure of logs and stone nestled against the mountainside with smoke curling from the chimney. He'd banked the fire that morning before heading out, and he thanked God for that small mercy now. Harrison kicked the door open and carried her straight to the hearth, laying her on the bearskin rug in front of the flames. He built up the fire quickly, adding log after log until the heat was almost overwhelming, then turned his attention back to his unexpected guest. Her dress needed to come off, that was certain, but propriety warred with necessity in his mind for only a moment before survival instinct won. He'd been a field surgeon during the war, had seen more bodies than he cared to remember. This was about saving a life, nothing more. He found one of his own shirts, soft from years of washing, and a pair of wool socks. Working quickly and averting his eyes as much as possible, he peeled the wet dress from her trembling body and replaced it with the dry shirt. It hung on her like a nightgown, reaching past her knees, and he pulled the socks onto her icy feet before wrapping her in every blanket he owned. Then he did something he hadn't done in 3 years of mountain living. He pulled her into his lap, held her against his chest, and shared his warmth the way he'd seen soldiers do for their wounded brothers in the brutal winters of the Shenandoah Valley. Her shivering gradually began to ease, and her breathing deepened. Harrison found himself studying her face in the firelight, noting the delicate arch of her brows and the smattering of freckles across her nose. She was beautiful in an understated way, the kind of beauty that revealed itself slowly rather than demanding immediate attention. He wondered what had brought her to this remote part of the territory, wondered if anyone was looking for her, wondered why the thought of someone else claiming her created a strange tightness in his chest. It was full dark when her eyes finally opened with clarity, focusing on his face with startled awareness. She jerked slightly, and he loosened his hold immediately, giving her space to pull away if she wanted. Instead, she stayed where she was, her honey-colored eyes searching his face with an intensity that made him feel exposed. "You saved my life," she said. Her voice was soft but steady, with an accent that spoke of education and Eastern roots. "Couldn't very well leave you to freeze," Harrison replied. "What's your name?" "Catherine Lawrence." She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts. "I was traveling with a wagon train heading to California. We were camped near Taos when my father became ill. He died 3 days ago, and the wagon master said they couldn't wait. They had to keep moving before the passes closed for winter. I stayed behind to bury him properly, and I thought I could catch up, but I got lost in the snow and my horse threw me at the creek." The pain in her voice was raw and fresh, and Harrison felt an answering ache in his own chest. He knew about loss, knew how it could hollow you out until you felt like nothing but an empty shell walking through the motions of living. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. "Sorry about your father, sorry the wagon train left you. That was wrong of them." Catherine's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "He was all I had left. My mother died when I was young, and after the war destroyed our shipping business in Boston, we decided to start fresh in California. Now he's buried in foreign soil and I'm alone, and I don't even know where I am or how to get anywhere from here." "You're in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, about 30 miles northeast of Santa Fe," Harrison told her. "My name is Harrison Granger and you're safe here. I give you my word on that." She studied him for a long moment, taking in his weathered face, his dark hair that fell past his shoulders, the breadth of his chest and arms that spoke of tremendous strength. He was perhaps 26 or 27, with blue-gray eyes that had seen too much and a scar that ran along his jawline. Despite his rough appearance, there was something in those eyes that made her believe him. "Thank you, Mr. Granger, for your promise at the creek, for bringing me here, for your kindness." "Harrison," he corrected. "No point in formality when you're wearing my shirt." A faint blush colored her cheeks, and she pulled the blankets tighter around herself. "How long before I can travel to Santa Fe?" "I have some money saved, enough for a stagecoach ticket back east, perhaps." Harrison considered the question carefully. Outside, the snow was still falling, and he could hear the wind picking up to a howl. "There's a storm coming in that's likely to last several days, maybe a week. Even after it passes, the trails won't be safe until the snow settles. You're looking at 2, maybe 3 weeks before I can get you down the mountain." Her face fell, but she nodded with resignation. "Then I'm afraid I'll be imposing on your hospitality for quite some time." "No imposition," Harrison said, and realized he meant it. The cabin suddenly felt warmer with another person in it, less like a hiding place and more like a home. "You need rest now. Take my bed tonight. I'll sleep here by the fire." Catherine started to protest, but exhaustion was clearly winning the battle. Harrison helped her to the rope bed in the corner, made sure she was bundled warm, and watched until her breathing evened into sleep. Then he returned to the fire, added another log, and sat staring into the flames while his mind churned with thoughts he couldn't quite name. He'd saved her life today, had made her a promise by that frozen creek, and already he could feel something shifting in the careful isolation he'd built around himself. 3 years he'd been alone on this mountain, 3 years of silence and solitude, and now this woman with sad eyes and auburn hair had stumbled into his world and turned it on its axis. The storm lasted 5 days, dumping snow until it was piled higher than the cabin windows, and the world outside became nothing but an endless white void. Harrison kept the fire burning constantly, kept Catherine warm and fed with venison stew and cornbread, and tried not to notice how right it felt to have someone to care for again. She was still weak from her ordeal, sleeping much of the first 2 days, but as her strength returned, so did her curiosity. "How long have you lived up here?" she asked on the third morning, watching him prepare breakfast with practiced efficiency. 3 years, give or take," Harrison replied, stirring the pot of oatmeal hanging over the fire. "Came up here after the war and never saw a reason to leave." "Were you a soldier, surgeon, battlefield medic, saw too much dying, saved too few lives?" His voice was flat, emotionless, but Catherine heard the pain underneath. "My father fought too. He was at Gettysburg." She wrapped her hands around the tin cup of coffee he'd given her. "He never spoke of it much, but I could see it in his eyes sometimes, the same look you have." Harrison served the oatmeal, sweetened with precious honey from his stores, and sat across from her at the rough-hewn table. "What was he like, your father?" Catherine's face softened with memory. "Kind, determined. After we lost everything in the war, he could have given up, but he didn't. He said we'd build something new, something better. He believed in second chances." Her voice caught. "I buried him on a hillside overlooking the valley, and I hope he would have found it beautiful." They ate in companionable silence for a while, and then Harrison found himself talking about things he hadn't spoken of in years. He told her about growing up in Virginia, about studying medicine in Philadelphia, about how the war had taken his younger brother and his best friend, and his faith in humanity. He told her about coming to the New Mexico territory, because he needed somewhere vast and empty to match how he felt inside, about building this cabin with his own hands, because creating something felt like the opposite of all the destruction he'd witnessed. Catherine listened with her full attention, never interrupting, never judging, and when he finally ran out of words, she reached across the table and took his hand. Her fingers were small and delicate against his calloused palm, but her grip was firm. "I think your brother and your friend would be glad you survived," she said quietly. "I think they'd want you to live, truly live, not just exist in isolation." Harrison looked down at their joined hands and felt something crack in the wall he'd built around his heart. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe you're right." As the days passed, they fell into a rhythm that felt almost natural. Harrison taught Catherine how to make sourdough bread from his starter, how to identify animal tracks in the snow, how to keep a fire at just the right temperature for steady warmth. She, in turn, brought life to the cabin in ways he hadn't anticipated. She sang while she worked, old ballads and folk songs that filled the space with melody. She reorganized his shelves with a system that actually made sense. She mended the tears in his shirts with neat stitches and teased him about the state of his sewing skills. They talked late into the nights, sharing stories and dreams and fears. Catherine spoke of her childhood in Boston, of wanting to be a teacher, of the loneliness of being an only child who'd lost her mother young. Harrison found himself opening up about his dreams before the war, about wanting to have a family practice in a small town where he could know all his patients by name, about the simple life he'd once imagined for himself. "You could still have that," Catherine said one evening as they sat by the fire, her shoulder almost touching his on the narrow bench. "It's not too late to go back to medicine, to have that life." Harrison turned to look at her, struck by how beautiful she was in the firelight, how her presence had transformed his lonely cabin into something that felt like home. "I'm not the same man who had those dreams. The war changed me." "It changed everyone who lived through it," Catherine replied. "But change doesn't mean you can't still want good things. It doesn't mean you don't deserve happiness." Their faces were close now, close enough that Harrison could see the flecks of gold in her honey-colored eyes, could feel the warmth of her breath. His heart was pounding in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion and everything to do with the woman beside him. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he raised his hand and cupped her cheek. Her skin was soft against his rough palm, and when she leaned into his touch, something in his chest expanded until it felt like he couldn't breathe. "Catherine," he said, her name a question and a prayer all at once. "Yes," she whispered, and he didn't know if she was answering the question he'd asked, or the one he hadn't yet found words for, but it didn't matter because then he was kissing her, and she was kissing him back, and the world narrowed down to this moment. This woman, this unexpected gift of connection he'd thought he'd never feel again. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but it deepened as Catherine's arms came up around his neck and Harrison pulled her closer. She fit against him perfectly, all soft curves against his hard muscles, and when they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "I didn't plan on this," he admitted. "Didn't plan on you. I didn't plan on being rescued by a mountain man who makes me feel safe for the first time since my father died," Catherine said, "but I'm not sorry it happened. Neither am I." Harrison pulled back enough to look into her eyes. "Catherine, I know we haven't known each other long, but these past days with you have woken something in me I thought was dead. I don't want you to leave when the snow melts. I want you to stay. Stay with me. Build a life with me. I'll take you down to Santa Fe. We can find a preacher, do this properly. I can't offer you much, just this cabin and whatever kind of life we can carve out of this mountain, but I swear I'll keep you safe and warm, and I'll do everything in my power to make you happy." Catherine's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "Harrison Granger, are you asking me to marry you? I suppose I am, though I'm making a mess of it." He brought her hand to his lips, kissed her knuckles with surprising gentleness given his size and strength. "I made you a promise by that frozen creek, promised you'd be all right. Let me keep making that promise every day for the rest of our lives." "Yes," Catherine said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, I'll marry you. I'll stay. I don't want to go back east to a life of loneliness and memories. I want to stay here with you and build something new, the way my father would have wanted." Harrison kissed her again, deeper this time, with all the passion and promise of a man who'd found something precious he thought was lost forever. The storm still raged outside, but inside the cabin, wrapped in each other's arms, they'd found their own warmth, their own shelter, their own home. The days that followed were filled with planning and dreaming, and more kisses stolen by firelight. They talked about what their life would look like, how Harrison could perhaps return to practicing medicine in one of the nearby settlements, how Catherine could teach children their letters and numbers. They talked about building a bigger cabin, about having children of their own someday, about growing old together on this mountain they both had come to love. When the storm finally broke and the sun emerged in a brilliant blue sky, they ventured outside together. The world had been transformed into a pristine wonderland of white, every tree branch heavy with snow, every surface glittering like diamonds in the bright light. Harrison showed Catherine his land, The stream that ran behind the cabin in warmer months, the meadow where deer came to graze, the view from the ridge that showed mountains stretching endlessly in every direction. "It's beautiful," Catherine breathed, standing close to his side. "I understand why you came here. It's better with you in it," Harrison said, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "Everything's better with you." They spent the next week preparing for the journey to Santa Fe. Harrison needed to lay in supplies anyway. And now they had the added purpose of finding a preacher and making Catherine his wife in the eyes of God and the law. Catherine helped him pack, helped him secure the cabin against animals and weather, and when they finally set out on his 2 horses, she looked back at the cabin with a smile. "I can't wait to come back here as Mrs. Granger," she said. Harrison, riding beside her, reached across the space between their horses and took her hand. "I can't wait to bring you back here as my wife." The journey down the mountain took 3 days of careful riding through snow-packed trails. At night, they made camp under the stars, and Harrison held Catherine close in their shared bedroll, marveling at how natural it felt to fall asleep with her in his arms. They talked and laughed and kissed, and with each passing mile, Harrison felt the last of the walls around his heart crumbling away. This woman had saved him just as surely as he'd saved her by that frozen creek, had reminded him that life was for living, that love was worth the risk of loss, that hope could bloom even in the frozen heart of winter. They reached Santa Fe on a cold afternoon in late January, the old adobe buildings glowing warm in the winter sun. The town was a mix of Spanish, Mexican, and American influences, bustling despite the season with traders and trappers and families making their lives on the frontier. Harrison took Catherine straight to a respectable boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Martinez, who took one look at Catherine's borrowed clothes and Harrison's protective stance and seemed to understand the situation immediately. "You need a dress for a wedding, yes, Mrs. Martinez said in her accented English, already ushering Catherine toward the stairs. "I have something that will fit you, pretty like you deserve. You men, you never think of these things." Harrison waited downstairs, pacing the parlor like a caged mountain lion, until Catherine emerged an hour later in a simple but lovely dress of deep blue wool that brought out the gold in her eyes. Her auburn hair had been brushed and pinned up, and she looked so beautiful that Harrison's breath caught in his throat. "Will I do?" Catherine asked, a hint of nervousness in her smile. "You'll more than do," Harrison said, his voice rough with emotion. "You're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." They found a preacher at the old adobe church on the plaza, a kind-faced man named Father Miguel who asked no questions about their unusual circumstances. Harrison suspected they weren't the first couple to come down from the mountains seeking marriage, and they likely wouldn't be the last. The ceremony was simple, just the 2 of them and Mrs. Martinez and her husband as witnesses. But when Harrison slipped a simple gold band on Catherine's finger and promised to love and cherish her all the days of his life, the words felt more sacred than any elaborate ceremony could have been. Catherine's vows were equally simple and equally heartfelt. "I promise to stand beside you, to build a life with you, to love you through all the seasons of our lives together. You saved me, Harrison, but more than that, you gave me a reason to want to be saved. I love you." "I love you too," Harrison said, and kissed his wife for the first time, sealing the promise he'd made beside a frozen creek into a bond that would last forever. Mrs. Martinez insisted they stay at the boarding house for their wedding night, refusing to hear any protests. She prepared a special dinner for them, enchiladas and beans and fresh bread, and afterward, she shooed them upstairs to the nicest room in the house with a knowing smile. Harrison carried Catherine over the threshold, and when he set her down, they stood looking at each other with a mix of desire and tenderness that made the air between them feel charged. "I've never," Catherine started, then stopped, blushing. "I mean, I don't know exactly." Harrison cupped her face in his large hands, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones gently. "We have all the time in the world, Catherine. There's no rush. We'll figure it out together." And they did, with gentle touches and whispered words of love, discovering each other slowly and thoroughly. Harrison was infinitely patient, checking in with her constantly, making sure she was comfortable, that she was with him every step of the way. Catherine, for her part, marveled at how this massive, powerful man could be so tender, how his calloused hands could touch her with such delicacy, how his strength became her shelter rather than something to fear. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, Catherine's head on Harrison's broad chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. His fingers traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder, and she'd never felt more content, more complete, more exactly where she was supposed to be. "I was so cold by that creek," Catherine said softly. "I truly thought I was going to die there, alone in the snow, and all I could think was what a waste it all had been. My father's death, the journey west, all of it for nothing. And then you appeared, like something out of a dream, and you wrapped me in your coat and made me that promise." Harrison kissed the top of her head, pulling her closer. "Best promise I ever made. Changed my whole life in one moment. Changed mine, too." Catherine propped herself up on her elbow, looking down at him. "I know some people would say we're rushing into this, that we should have waited, gotten to know each other better, but I feel like I know everything important about you. I know you're kind and strong and honorable. I know you'll keep your promises. I know you make me feel things I never thought I'd feel. That's enough for me." "More than enough," Harrison agreed, pulling her down for another kiss. "You're everything I didn't know I was looking for, Catherine Granger." She smiled against his lips. "I like the sound of that. Catherine Granger, wife of the mountain man." They stayed in Santa Fe for 2 more days, using the time to purchase supplies and a few necessities for Catherine. Harrison bought her a proper winter coat, sturdy boots, and enough fabric for her to make new dresses. He also bought medical supplies, telling Catherine about his half-formed plan to offer his services to the nearby settlements once spring arrived. "There are people scattered throughout these mountains who have no access to a doctor," he explained as they walked through the market. "I could ride a circuit, spend a few days in each place, help where I'm needed. It wouldn't be the small-town practice I once dreamed of, but it would be something. It would be using my skills for good again." Catherine squeezed his hand, pride evident in her eyes. "I think that's wonderful. And I could teach while you're making your rounds. There must be children in these settlements who need education." They made plans and dreamed dreams, and when they finally headed back up the mountain, it was as husband and wife, partners in building a new life together. The journey back was easier despite the supplies they carried, because they had each other, because they were going home together, because the future stretched ahead of them bright with possibility. The cabin welcomed them back with its sturdy warmth, and Catherine moved through it now with a new purpose, making it truly theirs. She unpacked her few belongings, arranged the fabric she'd bought, and stood in the middle of the single room with her hands on her hips. "We're going to need more space," she announced, "especially if we're going to have children someday." Harrison, who'd been stoking the fire, turned to look at her with a grin. "Already planning for babies, Mrs. Granger," she blushed but didn't back down. "Eventually, yes. Don't you want children?" "With you?" "Yes, I do." Harrison crossed to her, pulling her into his arms. "I want everything with you. A bigger cabin, children, a life full of love and laughter and all the things I thought I'd lost forever. You've given me back my future, Catherine." "You've given me the same," she replied, reaching up to brush his long hair back from his face. "I was so lost when you found me, and not just physically. I didn't know where I belonged anymore, didn't know what I was supposed to do with my life. Now I know. I belong here with you." The winter slowly gave way to early spring, and they spent those months learning each other in every way. Harrison taught Catherine to shoot, to track, to read the weather in the clouds and the behavior of animals. Catherine taught Harrison to laugh again, to hope again, to trust that happiness wasn't something that would be ripped away without warning. They worked side by side to expand the cabin, adding another room that would serve as both a bedroom and, eventually, a nursery. On warm days, they explored the mountain together. Harrison showed her the best fishing spots, the places where wild strawberries grew in summer, the hidden valley where a hot spring bubbled up from the earth. They made love under the open sky, surrounded by the beauty of the wilderness, and Catherine thought she'd never been so completely happy. As the snow melted and the trails cleared, Harrison began making good on his plan to offer medical services to the scattered settlements. His first trip took him to a small community of miners about 15 miles south, where he treated everything from broken bones to infected wounds to a difficult childbirth that might have ended in tragedy without his intervention. He returned home after 3 days to find Catherine had planted a garden and started teaching 2 children from a neighboring ranch to read. "The Hendersons live about 5 miles west," she explained, introducing Harrison to her pupils, a shy boy of 8 and his younger sister. "They heard we'd settled here and asked if I might teach their children. I hope that's all right." "It's more than all right," Harrison said, ruffling the boy's hair affectionately. "It's exactly what you should be doing." Their life fell into a pattern that was both productive and deeply fulfilling. Harrison made his medical rounds every few weeks, never staying away from Catherine for more than a few days at a time. When he was home, they worked their land, tended their garden, and built their future together. Catherine's reading lessons grew to include 6 children, and she loved every minute of it. The Hendersons and other neighboring families became friends, creating a small community in the mountains that looked out for each other. By midsummer, Catherine suspected she might be pregnant, and her suspicions were confirmed when she missed her monthly courses for the second time. She told Harrison one evening as they sat on the porch he'd built, watching the sun set over the mountains. "I'm going to have a baby," she said simply, taking his hand and placing it on her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby." Harrison's face went through a series of emotions so quickly Catherine couldn't track them all, but it ended on pure joy. He dropped to his knees in front of her chair, wrapping his arms around her waist and pressing his face against her belly. "A baby," he whispered. "Our baby. Catherine, are you sure?" "As sure as I can be without a doctor's confirmation, and since the doctor is you, I suppose you'll have to take my word for it." She ran her fingers through his hair, smiling down at him. "Are you happy?" "Happy doesn't even begin to cover it." Harrison looked up at her, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I never thought I'd have this. A wife, a child, a real family. I thought that part of life was closed to me forever." "Well, you were wrong," Catherine said gently. "You deserve this, Harrison. You deserve all the happiness in the world." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer and into fall. Harrison was attentive to the point of being overprotective, constantly worrying about Catherine doing too much, lifting too much, walking too far. She bore his concern with patient amusement, understanding that his fear came from love and from having seen too many things go wrong in his years as a battlefield surgeon. "I'm healthy and strong," she reminded him whenever he fretted. "And I have the best doctor in the territory looking after me. Our baby is going to be fine." She was right. On a cold February morning in 1878, Almost exactly a year after Harrison had found her shivering by the frozen creek, Catherine gave birth to a healthy baby boy with his father's blue-gray eyes and his mother's auburn hair. Harrison, who delivered countless babies during the war and in his months of circuit riding, found his hands shaking as he held his own son for the first time. "He's perfect," Harrison said, his voice thick with emotion. "Catherine, he's absolutely perfect. What should we name him?" Catherine asked from the bed, exhausted but glowing with happiness. Harrison thought for a moment, looking down at the tiny life cradled in his large hands. "Thomas, after my brother. Thomas Harrison Granger, if that suits you." "It suits me perfectly," Catherine said, holding out her arms for their son. "Hello, Thomas. Welcome to the world, little one." Fatherhood transformed Harrison in ways he hadn't expected. He was, if possible, even more devoted to his family now, working tirelessly to provide for them while also making sure he spent time with his wife and son every single day. He built a proper cradle for Thomas, carved toys from wood, and sang lullabies in his rough voice that somehow always managed to soothe the baby to sleep. Catherine watched her husband with their son and fell in love with him all over again, deeper and more completely than she'd thought possible. This massive, strong man who could bring down an elk with a single shot, who could survive alone in the wilderness for months, who had the hands and knowledge to heal the sick and injured, was reduced to absolute tenderness by their tiny son. He would sit for hours with Thomas on his chest, talking to the baby about everything and nothing, telling him stories about the mountain and the animals and the life they were building together. "You're going to grow up strong and brave," Harrison told Thomas one evening, the baby's tiny hand wrapped around his father's finger. "But more than that, you're going to grow up loved. You're going to know every single day that your mother and I would do anything for you, that you're the most precious thing in our world. You're going to have the childhood I want for you, full of safety and warmth and all the things a child should have." Catherine, listening from where she was preparing dinner, felt tears prick her eyes. This was what she'd gained from that terrible day by the frozen creek, this life of love and purpose and belonging. She'd lost her father, had nearly lost her own life, but from that loss had come something beautiful and true and lasting. As Thomas grew from infant to toddler, the cabin rang with laughter and the sounds of family life. Catherine continued teaching, now with 8 students who came twice a week for lessons. Harrison's medical practice had grown as well, and he was now well known and respected throughout the territory. People sought him out, trusted him, and paid him fairly for his services. They weren't wealthy by any means, but they had enough and more than enough. On a spring day in 1880, Catherine discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the news was less of a surprise but no less joyful. Thomas was 2 years old and talking in complete sentences, a bright, curious child who loved exploring the mountain with his father and listening to his mother's stories. "Thomas is going to be a big brother," Catherine told Harrison that night after their son was in bed. Harrison pulled her into his lap, kissing her soundly. "Another baby, another blessing. How did I get so lucky?" "We both got lucky," Catherine corrected. "That day by the creek, we both got a second chance at life. We both got to start over and build something new." Their daughter was born in November, a tiny, fierce little thing with Catherine's honey-colored eyes and a temperament that suggested she'd be a force to be reckoned with. They named her Charlotte Grace, and if Harrison had been smitten with fatherhood the first time, he was absolutely besotted now. He carried Charlotte everywhere, showed her off to anyone who would look, and declared her the most beautiful baby ever born. "You said the same thing about Thomas," Catherine teased. "And I was right then too," Harrison replied without shame. We make beautiful babies, Mrs. Granger." Life continued in its patterns of work and love and family. The children grew, the cabin was expanded again to accommodate their growing family, and Harrison and Catherine's love for each other deepened with each passing year. They had their challenges, of course. There were hard winters and crop failures, illnesses and injuries, the normal struggles of frontier life. But they faced everything together, their partnership unshakable, their commitment to each other and their family absolute. Thomas grew into a tall, strong boy who wanted to be a doctor like his father. Charlotte was indeed the force of nature her first cries had suggested, fearless and determined, and absolutely certain she could do anything her older brother could do. Harrison and Catherine raised them with love and discipline, teaching them to be kind and brave and true to their word. In 1883, when Catherine was pregnant with their third child, Harrison came home from a medical call with unusual excitement in his eyes. "There's a town forming down in the valley," he said. "About 20 families so far, and they're talking about building a proper church and a school. They've asked if I'd consider moving down there being the town doctor. They'd build us a house, give us land, make sure we had everything we needed." Catherine set down the shirt she'd been mending, considering. "What do you want to do?" "I want to know what you want," Harrison replied. "This cabin, this mountain, this has been our home. But the town would give the children more opportunities, more friends, a real school instead of just their mother's teaching. It would be easier for my practice, easier for you. We're not getting any younger, and those trails are hard in winter." Catherine looked around the cabin that had been her home for 6 years, the place where she'd found love and purpose and family. She felt a moment of nostalgia, but when she looked at Harrison, at the hope and excitement in his eyes, she knew what her answer would be. "I think we should do it," she said. "You've always wanted a small town practice, and this is your chance. The children would benefit from being around other families. And Harrison, we can still come up here in the summers. We don't have to leave it behind completely. This place will always be ours, will always be where our love story began." They moved to the valley that spring, into a sturdy 2-story house the town had built for them. Harrison opened his practice in a small office attached to their home, and Catherine took over teaching at the new schoolhouse. Thomas and Charlotte thrived with other children to play with, and when their third child was born that summer, another boy they named James, the whole town celebrated with them. But true to Catherine's word, every summer they packed up and spent a month at the cabin on the mountain. It became a beloved tradition, a time for the family to reconnect with the wilderness, for Harrison and Catherine to remember where they'd started, for the children to learn the skills and values that had shaped their parents' lives. On a warm July evening in 1885, Harrison and Catherine sat on the porch of the cabin while their children played in the meadow. Thomas was now 7, Charlotte 5, and James 2, and watching them together filled Harrison with a contentment so deep it was almost overwhelming. "Do you remember the day we met?" Catherine asked, leaning against Harrison's shoulder. "Every detail," Harrison replied, wrapping his arm around her. "You were lying by the frozen creek, lips blue, barely conscious. I thought you might die before I could get you warm. And then you opened your eyes and looked at me, and I knew my life was about to change. You wrapped me in your coat," Catherine said softly, "and you made me a promise. You said I was going to be all right. I meant it." Harrison kissed the top of her head. "And you have been all right, haven't you? We both have been." "More than all right," Catherine agreed. "We've been blessed beyond measure. 3 beautiful children, a good life, work that matters, and a love that's only grown stronger with time. I never imagined when you found me that day that we'd end up here with all of this. I never imagined I'd find someone who could heal all the broken parts of me, Harrison said. But you did, Catherine. You saved me just as much as I saved you. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. In the meadow, Thomas was teaching Charlotte how to identify animal tracks while James toddled after them, determined not to be left out. It was a perfect moment, the kind that makes up a life of love and commitment and shared purpose. As the years continued to pass, the Granger family became a beloved fixture in their town. Harrison's practice grew, and he trained Thomas in medicine when the boy was old enough, passing on his knowledge and his commitment to healing. Charlotte, true to her fierce nature, became a teacher like her mother and eventually the head mistress of the school. James, the baby of the family, showed an aptitude for business and eventually ran the general store. Harrison and Catherine watched their children grow and marry and have children of their own, and they embraced their roles as grandparents with the same love and devotion they'd shown as parents. But no matter how busy life became, they never forgot to make time for each other, never took their love for granted, never stopped being grateful for the chance encounter by a frozen creek that had changed both their lives forever. On their 20th wedding anniversary in 1897, Harrison took Catherine back to the spot where he'd found her. The creek was running fast with snowmelt, but the weather was mild, and they stood hand in hand on the bank where her life had almost ended and their love story had begun. 20 years, Catherine marveled. It feels like both a lifetime and no time at all. Best 20 years of my life, Harrison said. Every single day with you has been a gift, Catherine. Even the hard days, the struggles, the losses we've faced, it's all been worth it because I've had you by my side. Catherine turned to face him, taking both his hands in hers. His hair was now shot through with silver, and there were lines around his eyes and mouth that hadn't been there when they met, but to her, he was as handsome as ever. You kept your promise, you know, that promise you made when you wrapped me in your coat. You said I was going to be all right, and because of you, I have been more than all right. I've been happy, Harrison, truly, deeply happy. Harrison pulled her close, holding her with the same strength and tenderness he'd shown that first day. I love you, Catherine Granger. I loved you from almost the first moment, and I'll love you until the day I die and beyond. And I love you, Catherine replied, tears streaming down her face. My mountain man, my savior, my husband, my love, thank you for finding me. Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for building this beautiful life with me. They kissed there by the creek, the same creek where ice had nearly claimed Catherine's life, where Harrison had made a promise that had turned into forever. It was a kiss full of history and memory, of 20 years of love and partnership, of children raised and dreams fulfilled, of a promise kept and a life well lived together. The years continued to roll by, bringing both joy and sorrow as all lives do. They lost friends and family, weathered illnesses and hardships, but through it all, Harrison and Catherine remained each other's constant, each other's comfort, each other's home. They grew old together on the mountain they both loved, watching seasons change and children grow and the world transform around them, while their love remained steady and true. On a warm spring morning in 1912, Harrison woke in their bed to find Catherine watching him with the same honey-colored eyes that had captured his heart 35 years earlier. They were both in their 60s now, their children grown with families of their own, but when Harrison looked at Catherine, he still saw the woman he'd wrapped in his coat and promised to protect. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, reaching for her hand. "That day by the creek," Catherine replied. "I think about it often, you know, how close I came to dying, how lost and alone I felt, and then you appeared, my miracle in the snow." "You were my miracle too," Harrison said. "You brought me back to life, Catherine. Made me remember how to feel, how to hope, how to love." "We saved each other," Catherine said simply. "That's what love is, isn't it? Two people choosing each other day after day, year after year, saving each other in all the ways that matter." Harrison pulled her close, this woman who'd been his wife for 35 years, his partner in all things, the mother of his children and the love of his life. "That's exactly what love is, and I'd choose you again every single time. If I had 100 lifetimes, I'd spend every one of them loving you." They spent that morning in bed, talking and laughing and remembering, surrounded by the evidence of the life they'd built together. Through the window, they could see the mountains they'd called home, the creek where their story had begun, the land that had witnessed their love grow and deepen and endure. It was a good life, a full life, a life neither of them would trade for anything. Later that day, their children and grandchildren came to visit, filling the house with noise and laughter and love. Thomas was now a respected doctor in his own right, married with 4 children. Charlotte ran the largest school in the county and had 2 daughters who were already showing signs of their mother's fierce determination. James had expanded his general store into a successful business and had a son who was learning the trade. Harrison and Catherine sat on their porch, watching the chaos of family with deep satisfaction. This was their legacy, these children and grandchildren who carried forward the values they'd instilled, who knew they were loved beyond measure, who understood that family was everything. "We did good, didn't we?" Catherine said, leaning her head on Harrison's shoulder. "We did better than good," Harrison replied. "We built something that will last long after we're gone. Love that echoes through generations. That's about the best thing 2 people can do with their lives." As the sun set that evening, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Harrison wrapped his arm around Catherine and pulled her close, just as he'd done thousands of times before. She fit against his side perfectly, the way she always had, the way she always would. They'd been through so much together, built so much, loved so deeply, and as they watched the day fade into night surrounded by family, they knew with absolute certainty that every promise made, every choice taken, every moment shared had been worth it. Their love story had begun with a shivering woman by a frozen creek and a mountain man who'd wrapped her in his coat and made her a promise. It had grown into something neither of them could have imagined that day, expanding to encompass children and grandchildren, a community built on service and compassion, a lifetime of partnership and devotion. And it would continue long after they were gone, living on in the hearts of those they'd loved and who had loved them in return. Harrison and Catherine Granger lived well into their 70s, remaining active and engaged in their community until the very end. They died within months of each other, as if even death couldn't keep them apart for long. At their joint funeral, their children spoke of a love that had been legendary in its depth and constancy, of parents who had shown them what true partnership looked like, of a legacy of compassion and service that would continue through the generations. They were buried on the mountain they loved, near the cabin where their love had first bloomed, with a shared headstone that read simply, "Harrison and Catherine Granger, 2 lives saved by love, united forever." And on warm summer evenings, their grandchildren would sit on the porch of that old cabin, now lovingly maintained as a family retreat, and tell the story of how their grandfather had found their grandmother shivering by a frozen creek, had wrapped her in his coat, and had made her a promise that changed both their lives forever. It was a story of survival and second chances, of love found in the wilderness, of a promise kept through a lifetime of devotion. It was, in every way that mattered, a perfect love story with a perfect ending, one that would be told and retold for generations to come, inspiring others to believe in the power of love to transform lives and create legacies that never fade.